It didn't have to be this way. I keep returning to that realization as I read the daily news, as I read about the war in Ukraine, listen to the latest updates from climate change scientists, and try to comprehend that we have had in this country more mass shootings than days in 2023. We could have made different choices. We didn't have to divide the human family into groups based on skin color. No one forces men to denigrate women. There is no good reason to separate ourselves from other species or to destroy the ecosystems that give all of us life. That's just crazy. It didn't have to be this way. And that should make us profoundly sad. Lent invites us to adopt that posture of sadness toward ourselves and the world, a posture that's rooted in a deep sense of remorse. Now, that's not how most Christians live through Lent. Most of us are more familiar with giving up chocolate, Margie, or cutting out alcohol, or no meat on Fridays. Now, these spiritual disciplines actually can be very helpful. I try to adopt things like this every year. They're helpful as long as they are tools and not ends in themselves. Spiritual and religious practices are supposed to help us along a path to travel deeper into our faith. Consider, for example, the tiny little snippet we heard just a few minutes ago from the classic story of God calling Abraham to a new country. I doubt this dramatic change of life just happened in an instant. More likely, Abraham's lifelong faithfulness prepared him to respond to this divine call, to pull up generational roots and to travel toward a strange land. Pulling up roots from an old world in order to journey toward a new one. That's a wonderful image for conversion and transformation. And that's exactly why we hear this story during Lent. To take that image of physical migration as a metaphor for our spiritual migration. St. Paul did precisely that in his letter to the Romans this morning, where he praises Abraham. Not because he moved from one country to another or because he kept all the rules of some book somewhere, but because of his faith, because he trusted God for new life. Traveling to a new country is a wonderful image for our yearly journey through Lent. This season of remorse and repentance can help us realize that things didn't have to be this way. And therefore, they could be different now. I'm not talking about simple regret, all the shoulda, woulda, couldas, you know. Instead, I'm talking about what biblical traditions call lament. Lamenting can look like and feel like regret, but the difference is hope. Lament can lead us into the conversation Nicodemus had with Jesus, where we hear about fresh beginnings and new horizons. Just as God called Abraham to a new country, Jesus urges Nicodemus to be born from above, or born again, as today's evangelicals would call it. I grew up with that phrase. It was part of my DNA when I was born, I'm sure of it. And I wonder if we can hear that phrase anew this Lent. Perhaps we could embrace it and its wild freshness that it carries, this hopefulness of new birth that can stir in our hearts as we gaze on a world in distress. And I think it's really important for us to name what that distress is, to name the divisions in our communities and the denigration of God's creation, to name these pains and these wounds as clearly as we can, not for the sake of blame or guilt, but for the sake of healing. I mean deep healing. The kind that feels the way Abraham must have felt as he took those first steps toward a brand new land of promise. It's tempting and all too easy to treat this season instead as a time for bewailing all the things we didn't do or could have done better, or the things we shouldn't have done at all. That list just grows every day. I had coffee this past week with Jessica Naylor-Tatterson. As you may know, Jess sometimes preaches and presides here for us. She's a priest from the Anglican Church of Australia who lives here now in West Michigan. I'm so glad. Jess and I were talking about our jobs, our vocations, how complicated our daily work can sometimes be, the mistakes we make, the regrets we have almost daily, and especially how fruitless it is to dwell on what we didn't get right yet again. And just then, by the way, I asked her if I could tell this story, so she knows that I was going to do this. Just then, right at that point in the conversation, Jess rather casually said, "Yeah, you can't shame yourself into being a new person." Whoa! I'm sitting there having coffee with this amazing insight that just comes tumbling out of her mouth. You can't shame yourself into being a new person. I think that's exactly what Jesus was saying to Nicodemus. You can't follow the law back to Eden. You can't argue your way into paradise. There's no map. There's no rule book. There's no instruction manual. If only we just followed the rules better, we'd be fine. You can't shame yourself into being a new person. You can only be loved into healing and new life. For God so loved the world. Stop right there. I bet you know how that verse ends. We all know how that verse ends. I memorized it as a child as soon as I could speak. We see it on signs people hold up in football stadiums. It's John 3:16. For God so loved the world. Stop right there. I dare say all of us have trouble trusting those words. Some of us aren't sure whether we've earned that love. Others are anxious about what that love might demand of us and whether we're up to it. Still others can't help but worry when the love might be taken away. All of us at some point have trouble imagining that such a world of unconditional love includes us. It's far easier to think we can shame ourselves into being a new person. We can't. We can only be loved into life. We can only be loved into life. Very little in the world around us prepares us to believe in this kind of love. We're actually taught to be suspicious of it. If I can't pay for it, or if the price is cheap, then it's a sham. So, if you're like me, it's time to hear the gospel again as if for the first time. It's this. You cannot earn God's love. It is freely given to you forever. And there's absolutely nothing you can do that would make God stop loving you. Nothing. If we were to believe that, truly believe it, it would feel like being born again. Fresh, new, our resentments forgotten, our bitterness erased, our wounds tenderly healed. And we would never again wonder whether the world could have been different, because we would inhabit a world of love. The texts, the liturgies, the disciplines of this Lenten season are not ends in themselves. All of that is meant to help us receive the deathless love of God. That would change the world. It's actually the only thing that will.